Welcome to How to Overcome Your Past, Trauma 101. I'm Bethay, Certified Recovery Peer Specialist at Here Tomorrow in Neptune Beach, Florida. This workshop is just for information. By the end of the presentation, you may have some new ideas about seeking mental health treatment. Let's get started. What is trauma? Let's venture a basic definition. It results from an event, multiple events, or a set of circumstances that you perceive as physically or emotionally harmful or threatening. And that's what has those long-term adverse effects, not only on your development, but on your emotional well-being. Trauma is a natural emotional response. You might be able to readily label the events, or set of circumstances that got you to attend this workshop. But if you reflect over the experiences of your lifetime, maybe you had a parent that experienced substance abuse, or there was discord in your home, some sort of traumatic accident, incarceration, an act of violence, unexpected death of a loved one, neglect, natural disasters, bullying, an illness in the family. Any of these, depending on how you experience them, may lend themselves to the development of a trauma that hasn't yet been resolved. And that's natural. Acute, chronic, complex. I would like to draw your attention to the trauma lasagna. If your trauma has been repeated, prolonged, or you've had multiple exposures, it's only natural that you might acquire your own trauma lasagna, inside which the layers might consist of physical symptoms, flashbacks, trust and self-esteem issues, anxiety, depression, buried emotions. This is a trauma lasagna. Let's take a closer look at how you might have gotten here. There was a study done on adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that clearly shows the relationship between trauma and a greater risk for a whole plethora of mental health and physical health conditions later in life. Nadine Burke explains ACEs best in her 2015 TED Talk. Let's give her a listen.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer, and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California, and together we opened a clinic in Bayview Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle, and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand, better than we ever have before, how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, it is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you'll want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? You know, at first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness, I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and, frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across the lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real, and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement. Thank you.
Are you curious to find out what your ACEs score might be? Let's do it. Pause the video. For each of these 10 questions that you answer affirmatively, give yourself a point. Now you know. What did you score? Maybe you got a 4 or a 6 or a 9? What do you do with that? Well, knowledge is power. Now you know that some of your childhood experiences may be contributing toward what you're going through now with your physical or mental health. How does a, quote, normal person react to trauma? All types of stress reactions are natural, but there are 5 main categories. You may have heard of them: fight, flight, freeze, fawn, or flop. You know you best. Let's take a closer look at these categories and see which one of them resonates most with how you most naturally respond to serious stressors. It's not hard to recognize the person who responds with the natural fight instinct to trauma. Angry outbursts, controlling behavior, whether it be physically pushing, struggling, it could be verbally, explosive outbursts. Self-preservation is the name of the game. While it's true that many bullies and narcissists respond with the fight instinct to trauma, just because you respond with the fight instinct does not mean that you are a bully or a narcissist. It's simply your response to trauma. When something comes up and your body says it's time to go, your natural response is flight. High anxiety, panic, running, hiding, getting out of there, worrying, rushing around. You're workaholic, you're perfectionist, you're overthinker, can't sit still. Escaping situations is the flight. The person who has a tendency to freeze has a lot of difficulty making any decisions when a really major stressor comes up. They're tense, silent, numb, they isolate, they're stuck and feel brain fog. They just want to hide from the world. Some people in this state can disassociate, which is a protective factor as well. If a person has attempted fight, flight, and freeze and been unsuccessful in dealing with their trauma, a common response may be to revert to fawning or friending. These are your people pleasers, folks that have very porous boundaries, become overwhelmed, and are codependent on these relationships because of their own lack of identity. They're the ones that apologize all the time. The flopper is a lot like the freezer. However, they just become completely physically or mentally unresponsive by fainting or falling on the floor. Which one of these resonate most with you? I tend to fly or freeze. I wish I was a fighter, but I don't get to choose. My reactions are innate in me from my childhood, but now that I'm aware of my responses, I can begin to take steps so that I don't respond today to trauma that happened to me in my childhood with the same ineffective strategies. Perhaps now you have a better understanding or awareness of how you got here, but what to do with it. Treatment works to feel safe in the world again. If you take a look here, you'll see an overview of many options for trauma-focused psychotherapies. This is not an exhaustive list. There's more. So many times I hear people say to me, I tried therapy once, it didn't work. And I say, you know what, I tried to ride a bike once. I tried to get a job once. Heck, one time I even tried a relationship. Where is your warrior spirit? Give yourself a fighting chance and be willing to try something new or take a step in a new direction that you have not attempted before. You may be surprised at the results. If you've never tried medications or you suspect that your current med or dosage may be inefficient, don't hesitate to reach out to a medical professional to discuss the many options that are available to you. Like anything, do your homework, research, but don't delay in making that appointment for yourself. If you think this might be helpful for you, talk to a doctor. Hopefully you're inspired to seek some treatment if that's indicated, But what about the day-to-day? How are you supposed to cope in the meantime? I recommend mindfulness. Here are 6 ideas. None of them cost money, and all of them you can do at the drop of a hat. If you go online, there are lots of free programs to learn how to do breath work. Exercise, look at the photo. This person isn't hitting a gym. They're in their living room, just doing some stretches. Write it out. Grab a journal. This person doing yoga, same thing. They're in their den watching TV. You don't have to go to any hot yoga class. You can meditate like this gentleman by simply sitting in your backyard. Reading. Here's a book about mindfulness by Eckhart Tolle. Just some ideas on how to cope with stress and anxiety and the residual effects of trauma on the daily. So what does recovery from trauma look like? A lot of people, they start therapy or EMDR or a new medication, and they have the idea, finally, we've got gentle sunsets ahead. But actually, recovery from trauma looks more like this. Yes, there are gentle sunsets, but there are also pitfalls and hurdles to climb and bumps to go over. And that's what recovery looks like. It starts with very small incremental changes, and it grows into that beautiful sunset that you're seeking, but it takes time. I want to share an important idea with you. Everything that's happened to you, everything that you've been through, all of the things that you're struggling with now, at least in part as a result of all of those events and circumstances of the past, your situation is different. In your situation, the details of it are very particular to you. However, I find that many people recovering from trauma feel that their situation, their circumstances are so distinct from others that they're not capable of the same recovery that other humans can attain. I am here to tell you that you are not terminally unique, that your situation, while having distinguishable and important details and characteristics, does not exclude you from the human experience of overcoming. Despite the details, you can overcome as well. Thank you for participating in How to Overcome Your Past Trauma 101 workshop. I hope that this has helped you to better define how some of your past traumatic experiences have shaped you, and that you have resolved some next steps to improve your situation. Be sure to ask a peer here tomorrow about more workshop offerings, and cheers to your future successes.